collegefootballnerds.com coming at you pretty late this time. It's been a crazy holiday for Josh and I. Lots of family stuff, lots of talking to y'all on Twitter, and lots of work for both of us. Surprisingly, in the holidays, our work picked up. It didn't slow down. So here we are, a little late, better late than never. Going to talk Clemson, not Clemson, and Alabama. Going to talk about these two teams and how they got here and what we can expect Monday night. Remember, if you haven't already, it's this late in the year. You should have by now, but if you haven't already, please subscribe. We like to talk about all things college football. We do get nerdy, and we do expect you to bring your data in the comments. And I'm going to remind everybody in the comments this time, please let us know your score prediction. Please bring your data, not your flamethrower. All right, Josh, let's get it going. We're going to get through this really fast because we got a lot going on, but we said before the Notre Dame game that we still don't know a lot about this Clemson team, and that there's a possibility after the Notre Dame game that we still would have question marks surrounding Clemson because we weren't super high on Notre Dame. Now, just jumping right into this and probably going to piss Clemson fans off with just having this question, but are there still question marks around what we know about Clemson coming into the Alabama game?
So I do think there's a lot that we don't really know about either team, even coming out of that Notre Dame-Clemson game. Clemson really, to a large extent, dominated the competition they played, but they played in a poor conference. And it's not a dig on Clemson to say that the ACC had a bad year, because they did have a bad year. And if you want to go down and sort of like play with numbers and figuring out how good each team is, if you look at a profile of Clemson we use S&P Plus a lot. We mainly use it, one, because it's a solid objective metric. Two, it ranks every team number 1 through number 130 in terms of overall quality. So not saying it's necessarily the be all end all, but it gives you a pretty good solid idea of where teams rank. A lot of those ACC teams that Clemson played this year, they weren't top 50 teams. And I say a lot that if you look at all the big upsets in college football, those always take a top 50 team. At the very least, top 75. I can't find any example of a top team at any point losing. Even when you had Iowa upsetting Ohio State last year, that was a top 50 team. Purdue this year, as much as Purdue was unranked, it was still a top 35 team at the time they're playing, still even a top 50 team. So when you're playing teams like Georgia Tech, who's 82nd, Wake Forest, 64th, Florida State, 84th, Louisville, 107th, Boston College is 70th, Duke is 55th, Pitt is 69th in S&P. Those are all pretty low numbers. So, to a large extent, we didn't really know who Clemson was. Now, this goes to a second issue, which was, and this has always been a point you've had, you can learn a little bit by how you do against bad competition. So we knew Clemson dominated pretty much every game that I just listed. And we knew that Clemson was probably a really good team because of that. We just didn't really know where Clemson's ceiling was when you take all those into account, right? If you're beating Louisville, a lot of teams blew out Louisville, so it's really hard to distinguish yourself against them. The flip side was we thought on one hand maybe Notre Dame could do a better job than they did, though we may get into the model, but there was a little more concern with Notre Dame because they had so many one-score wins against teams of that caliber. And I think we kind of saw Notre Dame regress a little bit, while we saw that we still don't, I think, really know where Clemson's ceiling is.
Yeah, and I think it's fair. We've said it every Clemson game we've done this year was, hey, look, you can't help your schedule. Oklahoma had some duds on their schedule. Alabama had some duds on their schedule. Notre Dame had, a pretty middling 5-7, 6-6 average opponent type schedule. But to their credit, Clemson has dominated their schedule. And the thing that concerns me a little bit, if I'm a Clemson fan, is we kept saying that A&M data point in isolation isn't that relevant. It was a road game. It was a really, spirited A&M team, gave them all they wanted. But What do we say now that we have the A&M versus NC State data point where they blew them out just as bad as Clemson did? We have the South Carolina data point, which I don't think is entirely fair because Clemson was in control of that, though they did give up a lot of passing yardage to a mediocre quarterback. The one that I'm not talking about is Syracuse. Alabama fans keep bringing up the Syracuse game. It's ridiculous. Please stop bringing this game up. They were effectively playing with their third string quarterback who had no reps that week. You know Lawrence got 100% of the reps in practice because it was his first week starting. It was a road game against what turned out to be a pretty decent team. So that one I think is ridiculous. But looking at how the rest of their schedule unfolded, we say they took care of business. But my question is, if you replace Clemson with a 10-2, 9-3 type team from another conference, would they also have handled their business inside the ACC? That's a hypothetical, but I'd like for you to address it.
I think to a certain extent they would. Again, when you go back through it, I just look at top 25 teams in S&P Plus, and I don't care what the rankings are. Again, we can talk about the Syracuse game. I've always thought it's kind of weird how people talk out both sides of their mouth with that game. On one hand, you want to throw it out, I think justifiably, because it was Lawrence's first start. Now, I'll note Lawrence was 6.2 yards per attempt when he went out. Clemson was already losing when Lawrence was injured in that game. But I think just like in every other game, they've started slow. They would have picked up later. But also people want to use that as a ranked win for Clemson. I don't think you can do both. If you acknowledge the fact that you struggled in that game, you have to throw that aside. So, again, top 25, or really even, let's say, teams 1 through 30 in S&P, they've played 2. It's Texas A&M and Notre Dame. And outside that, quite frankly, there are a pretty good number of teams in college football that are going to beat teams outside the top 30 really consistently. The level of domination is one thing, but the results probably could have been replicated because the floor required to have that record is pretty darn low.
All right, so that brings us to really the game that they earned the right to be in, just like Notre Dame did, was the Notre Dame game. They won this 30-3. It was kind of an ugly game in that both teams really struggled offensively in the first half. Both had a decent drive early to get it to 3-3. And then it sort of broke open when Julian Love got hurt, and to his credit, Trevor Lawrence took advantage of that. Now, that's what a lot of Notre Dame fans said. And I agree with that in a lot of respects. They lost some really key players and were picked on. But Trevor Lawrence also made some really good throws. The Justyn Ross first touchdown he caught was an excellent read, an excellent throw. One of the things I noticed in that game, though, is, and this is what you see a lot with a freshman quarterback, he was a one-read guy. He was reading properly the defense at the line of scrimmage, and if it wasn't there, things got really uncomfortable after the snap. And I think part of that is, and this is where I'm going to turn, it sounds like I'm being negative about Clemson. This is where I'm going to turn around and be a positive. Part of that is what we said last year with Jake Fromm, what we said this year with Trevor Lawrence, is we don't know how they're going to react to a really good defense or a really good opponent or some kind of pressure because they haven't had to do that all year. To Trevor Lawrence's credit, I don't know that he's fully equipped to go through all of his progressions. I don't know that he's fully equipped to run an offense at a super high level like a junior or a senior would. He possesses the arm talent and escapability in the pocket to where it sort of neutralizes some of those deficiencies. And they were able to win in a game where I think if he was playing like a freshman, they probably lose that game or win it like 10-9. What do you think?
I think that's probably pretty fair. The thing that I would counter with to a certain extent is I think you're underestimating the role the receivers had in this game. Now, it's something we talked about quite a bit in our Notre Dame Clemson preview. If you watched it, was how the skill players are going to affect Notre Dame. We did an entire discussion that you brought up on how Notre Dame really hadn't faced skill position players of anywhere of this caliber. And the thing that we both kind of agreed on was that Clemson's receivers were at a different level. Now, if you've listened to our channel a lot, you'd know that I have been really, really high on Clemson's receivers all year. And to a large extent, to me, Clemson's offense is more about the receiving core than it is the quarterback. The quarterback's the big story. It's the thing everybody wants to talk about. And he has to be very accurate and consistent to be able to deliver the ball. But to me, I don't think their offense looks nearly this good if you swap the receiving cores.
I disagree because Kelly Bryant was running this offense in week 2 and it wasn't looking as good as it's looking right now. I don't think Kelly Bryant against that Notre Dame defense puts up 30 points. I do not think so. We saw this Clemson offense last year against Alabama. Granted, we haven't seen them this year against Alabama yet, but I do think that. So it's very analogous to Jalen Hurts and Tua at Alabama, where you have all of these talented skill players and they're all going underutilized because you don't have a guy that can do whatever he needs to do to get them the ball.
I mean, you say that Kelly Bryant couldn't do it, but Kelly Bryant had 12.1 yards per attempt against Texas A&M. He was 12 of 17 for 205 yards. And he didn't have the same sort of success the next 2 weeks, but he only threw 10 attempts in those games against Georgia Southern and Georgia Tech when they were starting to already transition to Trevor Lawrence. But I'm not really sold that Kelly Bryant would have been such a step back. Now, I think to a certain extent, you talk about Jalen Hurts, you have to be fair that Hurts as a freshman is the same problem you saw at times with Kelly Bryant, where when Hurts struggled or when Bryant struggled, it's not that they struggled to be a really good passer. They struggled to be a competent passer against certain teams. Would you agree with that?
Sure.
And so I get the transition from Bryant to Lawrence and trying to enable the passing game. I think what I'm getting at is I think it's a bit of a mistake to think that Lawrence is passing as a true freshman today at an elite level and not give enough credit to those receivers. Some of the bump between him and Bryant is due to the fact that Bryant really wasn't passing at that high of a level to start with. He had a phenomenal receiving core, 1. 2, the Texas A&M game, the one game that he played in where he was really challenged and led the offense, he was extremely successful. And I just think the receivers are phenomenal. I mean, there's that one touchdown catch against Notre Dame where, again, when Julian Love comes out, they throw to Higgins in the back corner of the end zone. The ball is on the wrong shoulder. It's behind the Notre Dame corner. Higgins tips it up to himself, catches it midair, falling through the end zone. There's another pass that's a bit sort of a back shoulder throw. I think it's Justyn Ross that catches that one, throws the Notre Dame corner to the ground, and runs the rest of the way to the end zone, right? So those plays are on the receivers. And most receivers would have never made that touchdown catch that Higgins made in the back of the end zone. And that was not really a correct throw. And I know they talked about it a lot, and the broadcast gave him a lot of credit, but the throw was over the wrong shoulder. That throw should be high and outside towards the back corner of the pylon because of the position.
Similar to Lawrence's throw against A&M that went for a touchdown.
Right, yeah, and it's when you say similar, and we've talked about this a lot, that throw was into double coverage. Now, it was a catchable ball, but Higgins goes up, takes the ball away from the corner on that touchdown throw against A&M, throws the corner down, and then sort of lets the corner and the safety run into each other, and Higgins takes it the rest of the way. The point being that was much more about the physicality of the receiver. The throw itself should never result in a touchdown if you have, even even above average receiver in that situation is not going to score on that play. And that's not saying, again, Lawrence is enabling that, but if you want to talk elite passers like Baker Mayfield at Oklahoma didn't always have great receiving targets, and he really elevated everybody around them. I think Lawrence is more enabling Clemson, and that's more than enough because the receivers are so good. But I think you do have to recognize how good the receivers are and realize that in many ways I think is more important than everything else going on in this offense.
So Alabama fans are like, okay, can you talk about us a little bit? So let's talk about Alabama. We know what we had coming into the Oklahoma game. The only question mark was Tua, and it looked like his ankle was good enough against Oklahoma's defense. I'm not convinced that he's 100%. There are pictures of him walking out of the stadium in a boot. He said at the end of the game the ankle was still iffy. I do think another week's probably leaps and bounds in terms of improvement to the ankle, but he was good enough to go 24-27. One of those was a 40-yard pass that was somewhat bobbled on the sideline, could have gone either way. As close to a perfect game as you could get, but they're facing a Clemson defense. And for those of y'all that want a little more detail on this particular component of Alabama's offense, There was an article in The Athletic that came out last week that talked about the slant that teams took away from Tua late in the season. And RJ Young, leading into the Oklahoma game on his channel, had about an 8-minute video on it. It was actually really good, so y'all should check it out. You should check it out anyway. He's an Oklahoma guy, but he knows his stuff. Alabama's bread and butter until the LSU game was the slant that we saw against Oklahoma. Oklahoma absolutely could not defend that because it was a pick your poison situation. Alabama would have run for 9 yards a carry if the linebackers weren't crashing and leaving that gap for him to hit that. Clemson's going to be able to take that away. So I want to talk X's and O's for a minute. What they're going to have to do, what they're going to do is be able to drop their linebackers into that space and defend the run with their front four, which they're very good against the run. They're very good against base formations, not having to sell out against the run. Are you a little bit concerned with Tua? Because we saw LSU, Mississippi State take that slant away. Tua struggled a good bit. Georgia took the slant away. Tua was injured, but he struggled a good bit. Auburn was the only game where they adjusted and he was able to exploit them with deep balls once they took the slant away. Are you concerned if you're an Alabama fan going into this game facing a defense that has the scheme and personnel that can take away that bread and butter play since we saw them struggle without it?
You always have to be concerned when you're facing an elite defense and their ability to take away something that you want to do primarily. Brett Venables has proven throughout his career that he's very good at doing that. So to your point, I think you do have to be concerned. Now, I think it's a mistake to think that's really the sole aspect of the offense, that Alabama can't operate without it. I think it's also a mistake to think that Clemson can't give away something by doing that. But kind of to your point here, my concern schematically is Clemson hasn't allowed anybody to run on them all year with their front. It just hasn't happened. If Clemson can take 4 guys and control the run game, that lets them drop their linebackers and not worry about compromising in the RPO schemes. Because the problem for Oklahoma, and you can talk about scheme all you want, the issue for Oklahoma was if they dropped their linebackers, they were going to get gashed by the run. That was the problem. They had to keep the linebackers crashing because they could not otherwise stop the run game. And if they couldn't stop the run game, you can't win. If Alabama could run for 8 yards per carry, they were going to win the game. So instead, they kept the linebackers aggressive. They basically said, we're going to give you the slant anytime if you can execute it, get time to throw the ball and put it on the money, you'll complete it. Because the slant is anytime you throw the ball, there's a better chance that the quarterback screws up or the receiver drops it. Something can happen and that might kill a drive. And Oklahoma was just looking for, some sort of self-inflicted error, which they got really on the only 2 times that Alabama didn't score was really just Oklahoma making them gradually march the ball down the field. Those 2 drives were in possessions where, both of us have been a little critical of the fact that Alabama, to me, went away from the slant game, tried to stick with the run game, and eventually they made a negative play that they weren't quite able to bail themselves out of. That's how they lost their 2 stalled possessions. To be frank, it really wasn't anything Oklahoma did. Oklahoma did not stop Alabama from scoring at any point. Alabama only stopped themselves on 2 occasions in the entire game. So I think you have to be concerned with it to a certain extent. I think you have to be more concerned because Clemson can actually stop the run. You can't. The whole point of the RPO is it is a pick your poison. You can't stop the slant without really sacrificing in other areas. But Clemson might be able to hold the run game enough with their front that they can move those linebackers back to take away that window and still survive. The problem with that, though, if you're Clemson, is if you take those linebackers back to take away the slant, you do greatly decrease your ability to blitz. And now you're looking at, you can't blitz a corner because that slant is wide open if the corner's blitzing. And that lets Alabama kind of operate their offense more freely, and you're really dependent on that point and your 4 front players to generate a pass rush. And if you don't have enough of a pass rush, that leaves the deep routes more open. So there's always a pick your poison scenario here. But I do think Clemson's a lot more able to do it probably than most teams because their front is so good, they can get away with dropping their linebackers and probably not get gashed by the run game.
Yeah, I think we saw with Oklahoma, they would rather yield a moderate to big play in the slant game than dying by giving up 8 yards a carry, which they would have done if they didn't crash the line. They still almost did it anyway, even with crashing their linebackers. Okay, so we've we've been on this a little bit this year. Clemson hasn't faced a lot of good passing offenses. Finley at NC State is an okay passer, but they were not able to take advantage of a very terrible A&M secondary. We've talked about Bentley shredding them a little bit. We've talked about Kellen Mond shredding them a little bit. The couple of times we've seen this show up might indicate that Tua can take advantage of this secondary. How comfortable are you on the Clemson side that you can stop this Alabama? Well, let me flip that, because maybe nobody can fully stop Alabama. Do you see things that scare you if you're a Clemson fan in terms of potentially giving up a big day through the air because of the things in the secondary, or are those numbers that those quarterbacks put up more of an aberration?
There should be things that you see that scare you, I think. Something that sticks out to me watching Alabama this year is the sheer athleticism they have at receiver. The four deep at receiver is just freaky athletic and fast. And it's very difficult to scheme to take away one of those guys, because it's not a situation that they had been, it's not a Calvin Ridley situation. You can't take away the primary target and live. It's the situation that Georgia ran into in the national title game last year. They're just stupid deep, and they'll throw it to whoever has single coverage, and whoever that is has a decent chance of being better than your guy. If you're Clemson, the fear here, and I truly believe, is that your secondary in single coverage has not done a great job when the quarterbacks had time to deliver the ball. Now, that hasn't happened very often. Clemson has been so dominant, and it's not just the front, right? I mean, it's Brian and Farrell and all those guys, and their ability to rush the passer, not giving opposing teams time to really throw the ball. But Tanner Muse is not going to stay with Jerry Jeudy. Not even close. If Alabama has time to throw, they can really exploit that Clemson secondary. And I want to draw sort of a comparison with two different teams and styles of defense to sort of bring home this point. Alabama struggled with Georgia in particular, in my opinion, because Georgia is so athletic in their back seven. Georgia is stupid talented. Now, they're not a great team right now, but with DeAndre Baker and Stokes, I mean, they've got great, super talented corners. There are a lot of NFL players in that secondary. Alabama was not able to get separation due to their speed and athleticism to the level they were accustomed to when they were playing Georgia. Now, Georgia plays Texas, and that athleticism wasn't such an advantage. And the reason, to a certain extent, that Texas upset them was that Texas was able to out-physical that secondary. They had big physical receivers. Alabama doesn't have big physical receivers. They have fast, athletic receivers. It's a completely different matchup. Now, I'll toot our own horn a little bit, and something our model had Texas scoring 27 points against Georgia, and it had very, very similar yardage statistics. So that sort of a side discussion, but our model was not surprised by Texas's score. It was more the fact that Georgia didn't score more than they did that was surprising to our model. But so that's sort of, one thing with Alabama. The other set of matchups I'll talk about is Notre Dame versus Clemson. Notre Dame had really tall, big physical receivers like Boykin, and they're slow. Now, Boykin's a really good receiver, and I don't want a Notre Dame fan listening to this to think that we're saying Boykin's not, but he doesn't have burn you speed. And the issue with Clemson, to a certain degree, in my opinion, is I don't think they have great athleticism in the secondary. And what we saw against South Carolina, particularly Deebo Samuel, was a nightmare for Clemson because they didn't really have anybody that could match up with him and stay with him and not give up a cushion.
Right. And Alabama's got four Deebo Samuel.
And that's not an exaggeration. Alabama probably does have four guys of similar caliber to Deebo Samuel. It's almost unfair. So the thing that kind of is in the back of my mind with this game to a certain degree is a couple times we've seen Alabama in these playoff level BCS games, Michigan State a few years ago, Notre Dame in 2012, some really, really good defenses they played that they throttled because those teams ended up having to match safeties against Alabama's receivers, and the athleticism just couldn't stay with Alabama. Alabama didn't necessarily, dominate Michigan State at the line of scrimmage. They didn't run the ball in a dominant fashion, but they could block it well enough to force Michigan State to have their safety stay in coverage, and they just got the top blown off them. And I'm not saying this game's going to be dominant to the extent that Michigan State or Notre Dame were. I mean, there's for one side of that, the problem was that neither one of those two teams could score in Alabama, but it is a concern with Clemson because I do think there's a similar issue here. Clemson has not faced teams that have nearly the athleticism that Alabama has in the at wide receiver. Notre Dame was a completely different matchup, and it's sort of like Notre Dame itself was in 2012, where their secondary, again, that season never played anybody that could really challenge them deep in any way, and they got exposed. There's a danger of that here for Clemson, and that point is reinforced by the fact that Clemson this year did struggle so badly with Deebo Samuel at South Carolina and with the receiving core of Texas A&M. Really the only two teams that had good receiving cores that they played, and neither one of those teams is really even remotely on the level that Alabama is this year.
Is the flip side of this also true in that, Ross and Higgins, these types of skill players are going to give Alabama secondary a little bit of trouble? We saw CeeDee Lamb really take advantage from a physical and somewhat technique speed standpoint, take advantage of Patrick Surtain on one side, and, Marquise Brown was injured. I don't think he was 100% in that game, but we saw two things in the Oklahoma game. One, we know Clemson has. Two, we don't know on the second one. One was CeeDee Lamb just being able to bully his way down the field, get some well-timed push-offs, and also just make some good plays against a young secondary. We also saw a couple of massive coverage busts from guys coming off the line, either lined up in the tight end spot or coming out of the backfield where nobody, this is something we flagged early on in the season. Matt Wilson, way out of position, guy catches a 5-yard, throw in the flats and romps for 45 yards. Is this something on the other side that Clemson can exploit, just like Alabama might be able to exploit with their wide receivers?
I definitely think it's a possibility because CeeDee Lamb had a tremendous amount of success by just out-physicaling Alabama's corners. And I think Alabama's secondary this year in general is really good. And it's, in a lot of ways, it's like Georgia with similar problems. They can get out-physicaled a little bit. They're not the biggest guys. The loss of Trevon Diggs, who was their number one corner early in the season, to a foot injury really hurt them in terms of size and strength. And the effect of that was that you had Surtain as a true freshman going against CeeDee Lamb, and he got pushed around. He didn't stay with Lamb physically. Lamb is not on the level of T. Higgins. I truly believe T. Higgins is easily one of the best receivers in college football. And it's a real concern for Alabama, and if their corners are going to be physical enough, because I've several times this year, Savion Smith has been pushed around.
Isn't it ironic that their nickel corner is the one that's the most physical and probably the best cover corner?
I don't know about best cover corner, but I think the thing to remember with him is Shine Carter was a safety, right? That's playing nickel corner due to the injury situation. So I don't think it's shocking that he's the most physical because he was being trained as a safety. The problem with him is as much as he's got his agility, I don't think Shine Carter has long speed, as they call it. I think you can get away with that in the slot, but I think they'd have issues if they put him on the boundary with him staying with guys just deep downfield.
I think he's easily the best with the ball in the air.
No, I agree with that. I mean, if he's in position, I think he's the best with the ball in the air. He's the most physical, and he's in a lot of ways, he's kind of their best corner. I think they're just afraid to put him on an island because they can get burned.
All right. We saw that Notre Dame. So I think Etienne had like one really long run, 62, 68 yarder. For the most part, they shut him down, which wasn't entirely surprising. Notre Dame has a very good, borderline elite, if not elite, run defense, better than Alabama's, I think. But do you think Alabama will have similar success in slowing the run game down enough that it's going to have to be Trevor Lawrence and these wide receivers that beat Alabama? Or are they going to be able to do something schematically to exploit it in a different way?
I think Alabama's probably going to make Clemson have to throw the ball. I mean, Clemson has been stopped on the ground this year by better run defenses. And the first thing, to your point, one of the statistics we draw up in our model is this percentage of opponent averages allowed. Yeah, so one of the major statistics we get into here is opponent averages allowed, right? So if your opponent's average 5 yards per carry and you allow 4, you're allowing 80% of their averages. Notre Dame allows 89%. Going into the Clemson game, allowed 89% of opponent rushing averages. Alabama's run defense isn't quite what they have been, but it's at 69%. It's 20% better than Notre Dame's. And if you want to think about distance from the mean, being 100%, Alabama holds teams 30% under their averages. Notre Dame's only hold teams 10% under their averages. They just haven't faced teams that run the ball very well, frankly. So I do think it's a little bit of a mistake to think that Notre Dame's run defense isn't necessarily better than Alabama's. I don't think it's backed up statistically. And I know they're good in efficiency metrics and some other things. There's a lot of problems with that because of the style of, as we talk about a lot, when competition varies, it changes the ways you can play things. And when you don't play competition above a certain level, especially offensively, you get in the issue where for 2 years running, we've been critical of Michigan's defense because we noted 2 years ago they were giving up 32 points per game to any time they played a top 50 offense. You can play teams straight up in a certain way if they're not good enough and look really good defensively. And then especially we see this a lot of northern teams. It's like I don't think they have the talent, the depth of talent to be able to be very multiple. And when they play dynamic offenses, it kind of falls apart. So getting into the model here, again, this percentage of opponent averages allowed. The first thing to notice that both these teams are pretty darn good. After the bowl games, rerunning it, Alabama is now at 70% of opponent rushing averages and 78% of opponent passing averages. Those are both really elite numbers. Alabama is bordering on elite on the run defense, between elite and really good. 70% is kind of my mark for elite. Anything under 80% against the pass, I consider to be elite. Clemson's giving up 55% of opponent rushing averages, and then 82% of opponent passing averages. So better against the run. Dominant, I would say, 55% against the run. And very good against the pass, but not necessarily elite against the pass. And that's a relative weakness, right? 82% is still a better mark than most teams. But it's still, there are some weaknesses there. And how does that sort of shake out? Well, our model looks at per play statistics. We don't look at total yardage. So the number of plays run or how long a game takes is not factor in here. We're looking how you did on a per play basis to throw out tempo and all those other things. We do that to sort of project how your offense is going to do in this game because we're looking at how you did versus your opponents, how the team you're playing did against their opponents, how their opponents did against everybody else to sort of have a purely relational idea of how good you are and then how good where those pluses and minuses fit in a matchup against each other. Based on that, Alabama is expected to run for only 2.9 yards per carry, which is pretty dismal. That there's no run game expected from Alabama here. Not surprising because Clemson's run defense is so good. Clemson's expected to run for 4.6 yards per carry, which is enough to be competent. That number's usually I put at 4.5%, not much more. The difference, interestingly, is in the passing game. Alabama is expected to average 9.1 yards per attempt. Clemson is only expected to average 6.3. Now, I put competent passing at 6.5 yards per attempt. So what that's saying is that Alabama is going to be rather effective in the passing game and Clemson's not. And that's expected to give Alabama an edge in yards per play at 5.9 yards per play to 5.5 for Clemson. Based off that and your past history, what our model does is it self-determines it self-builds its own scoring model unique to your team. Now that factors in things like, not just how many points you scored in previous games, what your yardage was in those games, did you score points off turnovers, that kind of thing. It's neutral. If you want to ask me, do I factor in injuries? Did I factor in only games where Lawrence played? No, because that's me sticking my hand in the model and trying to tell it how much those games should or should not matter. And frankly, with Clemson, I can't consider only games where Lawrence started because I really can't afford to throw out, for example, the Texas A&M game because the schedule is too weak to do that. There's only one other top 30 team on the schedule, that was Notre Dame. I'd give that game way too much weight if I did that. So based off that, this model as a neutral, just starting baseline for discussion, has the score at Alabama 35, Clemson 31.
I'm not surprised that it's a pretty close score margin. Everybody's kind of said, this is the matchup. It's now Clemson and Alabama on one bus, and then there's another rest of y'all bus, I think, at this point. I'm not as influenced by the poor quality of competition from Clemson. Again, I've said it all year. I don't think you can help that. They've been in this game and in these playoffs plenty of times to show that they're not just a function or a product of their schedule. So I'm not surprised with that either. The one thing that's really tough for me in this matchup, though, is this is the first time that Alabama's had a lethal offense. I don't think it's fair to say Clemson's offense is lethal at this point. Yes, they put up 70 on Louisville and 40-something in every other game, 59, I think, against Florida State. I don't think they're lethal against a defense like Alabama's. I have some concerns about Christian Miller. He's not going to play. If he plays, he's not going to be effective in this game. I think that impacts you a little bit, and maybe we can talk about that at the end. But I want to talk a little bit more about numbers, but I want to ask you this one thing. And I don't want Clemson fans to get mad at me for asking this question, but we're about to give our scores. Two things. One is, in a lot of ways, Oklahoma a scarier matchup for Alabama. And two, is Clemson almost running a pro-style offense at this point because of the throws they're asking Lawrence to make, the fact that he's not running that much, and is that why maybe Clemson isn't as scary a matchup for Alabama as an Oklahoma would be?
So I had said before that I thought Oklahoma was probably the toughest matchup for Alabama, and the reason for that being Alabama's offense is freaky good. It's just really, really, really good. And a lot has been said this year that Oklahoma's offense, like if you looked at S&P, their rating was highest ever. And they had a 5-point gap on the rest of the field, 52.5 points rated. They were expected to score over 50 points against an average top 50 team. Basically, an average Power 5 team still expected to get 50 points. Alabama, though, is at 47.5. And I think something that's a little underrated is the gap that Oklahoma had against Alabama is the same gap Alabama has against Ohio State, who's 5 points lower than Alabama. Clemson's a little bit lower than that. So the problem for Alabama was they can score a ton of points against anybody, or should be able to. And now it's easy to look at that, like the Mississippi State. Well, they won 24-0. Well, Mississippi State wasn't going to score in that game, and Alabama didn't really have to be aggressive. One, and two, you do have to factor in the fact that Tua Tagovailoa was not the same quarterback when he was injured. He wasn't. He was missing a lot of stuff, a lot of throws that he'd normally make, and it really limited their offense because they couldn't move him around in the pocket. Also, Mississippi State may have lost their bowl game, but they gave up 170 total yards and negative 19 yards rushing. It's hard to lose when you do that. They found a way to, but they've kind of stopped everybody. The point here being, though, is that Oklahoma can outscore you even if you're really good. And that was the problem Alabama ran into in the game, right? That they kept scoring and kept scoring and kept scoring, and they just never pulled away because they couldn't quite keep out Oklahoma from scoring themselves. Now, I'll mention our model numbers there in the yardage statistics. Our model in that game had Alabama at 11.7 yards per attempt and 5 yards per carry. They ended up with 11.7 yards per attempt and 4.8 yards per carry. So our model pretty much had it exactly pegged with how much Alabama was going to move the ball. And then for Oklahoma, it had them with 9.1 yards per attempt and 4.6 yards per carry. They ended up 8.3, 5.1. So pretty similar there too. And then the model's projection was 49-41, 8-point difference. It ended up being 11. That game was pretty much exactly what our model statistics thought it was going to be. Again, not the be-all, end-all, but the model is a baseline. That game played out exactly as you would expect it to, which is the point I'm trying to get to with that. Alabama's offensive statistics were so dominant that it's almost effortless to score. Now, Oklahoma at 8 yards per attempt, 5 yards per carry is enough to sustain an offense and score a lot of points, like 34 points. Alabama was so much in terms of yardage that it took them really screwing up on any given drive not to score. That's that difference that extra few yards gets you. Against Clemson, these numbers aren't going to be that high. And the problem with that is these teams are probably going to stall. They're going to end up punting in the game. Clemson's not going to score almost every drive. Alabama's not going to score every possession, but it makes it a little easier for Alabama to pull away because if Alabama's numbers look like what Oklahoma's were against Alabama, they still score 30-something to 40-something points. And if Clemson's numbers are just a yard or two under that, then they probably end up punting a few times. And it just gives Alabama more of a chance to pull away because of the strength of their offense. I think that's why it's a tougher matchup between Alabama and Oklahoma.
And that's really no shot at Clemson. There are paths I see for them to win this game. Playing it straight up, I don't think so, because I think the style of offense they play, we talk about, and look, Clemson fans have been on us all year because we've said, Trevor Lawrence isn't a mobile quarterback. He's not a mobile quarterback as a function of their offense. He's not like Kyler Murray is. He's not going to get 120 yards rushing in a game. In this game, he's going to throw it. He's going to throw it between 35 and 40 times in this game, guaranteed. Where he is mobile and where it does help him, and it helped him a lot against Notre Dame, is he can get around a blitz. He can buy himself time. He is very athletic. He's just not a speed burner like a Kyler Murray. So he's going to avoid a blitz, one or two blitzes, which is going to leave Alabama's secondary exposed, and he might take advantage of it. So I don't want Clemson fans to think when we say he's not mobile that he's, a statue back there. But the type of offense that they've moved to with Trevor Lawrence, especially in a game where they see Etienne and Adam Choice not being able to run the ball very effectively in like an RPO concept, is a pro-style offense, which Alabama generally doesn't struggle with, and the opportunity every once in a while, because he doesn't run, to get a 3rd and 8 when he pulls it on an RPO. That's what they're facing, and I just don't see that challenging them in the way that Oklahoma did. Now, like you said, Alabama's not going to score every play either, or every drive either. Alabama could have scored 70 points against Oklahoma. And now, I think Clemson could have scored a lot more against Notre Dame too, but Nick Saban and Dabo Swinney he even did this against South Carolina. They don't play and coach to cover. They play and coach to win and get their players out. And I think he pulled a lot of guys in the fourth quarter as well. I'm not worried about Dexter Lawrence as much. I know he's a great player, but I think they have quality backups there where Alabama doesn't. I'm very worried about Christian Miller if I'm Alabama, because they're not going to be able to get pressure on the pass in the pass game. I think they're going to try to recreate Christian Miller a little bit with maybe Mosley, and then maybe the freshman Russian, the quarterback.
Anoma.
If he's not in the doghouse. But because of the offensive scheme that Clemson employs, and because of what it took for them to score against Notre Dame, which was stall, hit a bomb, I don't think they score that much against Alabama. Give me, and I'm sorry, Clemson fans, I hate to do this, and I will eat all the crow in the world if I'm wrong. Give me the 40-24 Alabama.
Okay, so again, I kind of hate to say this to Clemson fans too, but you're not too far off from me. I'm going to give you the sort of statistic I dug up for this game, and that's, I looked at top 60 teams. So top 60 teams that Clemson's played. They've only played 6. Texas A&M, Syracuse, NC State, Duke, South Carolina, and Notre Dame. In those 6 games, let's throw Notre Dame out, okay? So the first 5 of those 6. In those first 5 regular season games, they struggled or were deficient in one of 3 areas in every game. Run offense, pass offense, or overall defense. Texas A&M held them to 3.59 yards per carry. NC State held them to 2.84 yards per carry. Syracuse held them to 6.1 yards per attempt. I understand that's a weird game, but roll with me here. Duke held them to 6.4 yards per attempt. And then if you looked on the other side of the ball on offense, they gave up a high watermark for yardage against A&M and South Carolina. That was the 18th ranked offense and the 36th. Syracuse was all the way down at 42nd. And what I basically found is if you ran S&P unit statistics, it tracks almost exactly with any time they faced a top 50 unit. So top 50 rush defenses, who did they face? Well, they faced Texas A&M, who's 18th, and they got held to 3.59. They faced NC State. They got held to 2.84. And that was pretty much it. South Carolina is not a top 50 defense, especially now that injury at the end of the year. They're not even resembling that. The other side of the ball, 16th ranked offense was A&M. That was their worst yardage day. 36th ranked offense is South Carolina. That was the second worst yardage day. And what I've seen is that Clemson, and it concerns me, is their performance tracked almost exactly with the quality of the opposing units they faced up until Notre Dame. So the question is how much weight you want to give to that. At the end of the day, that Notre Dame game, to me, I think that was a game where Julian Love went out. Clemson hit a couple shots that took what was a 3-9 game.
Well, even to get to the 9 was a shot.
Right.
That was the sideline corner falling down first time they exploited Julian Love's absence.
No, you're right. So it was a 3-all game, and then right at the start of the second quarter, Justyn Ross takes a 52-yard pass on the backup corner, throws a guy down and scores. And then your next touchdown ends up being a 42-yard pass to Justyn Ross. And then your last touchdown of the half is the T. Higgins catch. So you've got 3 touchdowns here that took them from 3-3 to 3-23. Essentially, almost the entire scoring differential was against that backup corner and this isolation issue. And if you take just that 152-yard play away, this is kind of an interesting thing from that, to Justyn Ross, that first score, Trevor Lawrence was 6.875 yards per attempt. If you take out the other long play to Justyn Ross, the 40-yarder, that number drops to about 6 yards per attempt. They were not effective outside those 2 plays on offense.
Yeah, but I will counter. I'm going to put my Clemson hat on. My South Carolina graduate wife will cringe when she hears me say that, but she doesn't watch the videos. So unlike Josh's wife, who does watch the videos, my wife doesn't. She says we're boring. I'm going to say we were up 30-3 in the third quarter, so we shut it down and we didn't need to do anything else. So that kind of jaundiced our statistics in a way. Like Alabama, they stopped blitzing. They wanted to make sure that they cared more about Oklahoma scoring or taking 5-6 minutes to score than they cared about the actual score, because that's how you win the game. So I'll give you a little bit of pushback there, but I'll also take one back. Their last game before Notre Dame was 42-10 versus Pitt. And everybody said, okay, Clemson beat Pitt 42-10. Notre Dame beat him 19-14. Trevor Lawrence was worse in this game. 12 of 24, 118 yards, 4.9 yards per attempt. That is really bad. And he's had a couple of games like this where he put up like 80 yards passing in one of their big blowouts. 118 here, 4.9. They had a 75-yard run for Travis Etienne. Let's really get into it. If you look at it, it was 28-10 at the half. The first play of the game, 75-yard run. Their second snap was third drive, 1 play, 3-yard touchdown because it came off a turnover. They got 14 points off of 2 snaps in the game. So a lot of similar stuff was happening there. That's where I think it kind of takes it away, where Oklahoma was really hard to get off the field, and these mobile quarterbacks that give Alabama trouble are really hard to get off the field on 3rd and 7, or they're always in 3rd and 2. Clemson's offense is more, run the ball, throw the ball, hit something over the top, and that just doesn't generally give Alabama fits. I do think if they make Lawrence a little more mobile, they can have some success there. But even then, I'm giving them 24 points, thinking they've got the athletes on the outside. They're going to hit some of these big plays. But there's a difference in being able to score and consistently score. And the second you have a couple of 3-and-outs against Alabama, just ask Clemson fans what happened when Alabama couldn't get a first down for 2.5 quarters against them in 2016. We saw what happened. They lost the game, or Clemson won the game. So give me your score on this one. Let me hear what you think about that.
So as I said, mine's not too far off from yours. I'm at 42-24, which is a pretty big scoring differential. It's way outside the Vegas line. But that's essentially taking 1 touchdown away from Clemson in our model and giving 1 touchdown to Alabama.
Well, you're so magnanimous giving things away like that.
Yeah, well, he who giveth taketh away, right? Our model has this closer than the spread. which looking it up, the spread's at 5.5. I think now it's moved down a little bit, and our model has it a 4-point game. We've talked about this before. Whichever way the spread falls versus our model, it tends to skew further towards the spread. So this is close enough that it doesn't really surprise me, or I think it's a factor. I'm always really concerned when you see Michigan, Ohio State was this way, where our model had Michigan like a 12-point favorite, and then the spread was 4. That's never a good sign. What that usually means is that Vegas really thinks the numbers and the metrics, because again, we're giving you a baseline, aren't indicative of the actual game. It's just there's a large number of problems with this prediction. One, we talked about this a lot. Notre Dame and Clemson were both essentially the co-ACC champions, if you want to look at it that way. And our model has to assume that the conferences are more or less equal. There's maybe a point where I can try to figure out a way to equalize that. There is no good way to do it. There's no way for me to do it in a neutral fashion. And quite frankly, these conferences are not remotely equal. So when you take that into consideration, I think you have to realize the stats are probably lying to you a good bit. A lot of what you see in terms of movement towards Clemson's based off their Notre Dame game. Now, this has happened before. Clemson, when they've played Alabama a couple times, including when they beat Alabama, and particularly the year prior when they actually lost, Clemson was not a great team for a lot of the year. And they really clicked at the end of the season, played at a different level, and ended up playing close to Alabama or beating them. If you were to look at where Clemson was halfway through the season, where Alabama was, it really wasn't much of a contest either one of those years. But they got red hot at the end of the year. So the thought, I think, from a lot of people in Vegas is that Clemson's red hot. There's something to be said for that. I would normally probably hedge that way. The thing that gives me so much pause is we felt like we knew so little about Notre Dame. There were so many red flags with Notre Dame. Notre Dame essentially comes out of the same conference. And again, the big thing to me is, I had it backwards earlier, South Carolina was the most yardage given up, not A&M. But every time Clemson's faced an elite unit in one area, or even really they haven't faced many elite units, but a very good unit in one area or another, they've badly struggled in that game. So it just gives me really serious pause to draw too much from any of those when, like with Notre Dame, in terms of efficiency offense, they're 55th, okay? Alabama is number 1. Most efficient offense in college football. Totally different matchup. And I just don't think the success that Clemson had against Notre Dame is going to translate to Alabama. I think you have to give a lot of pause to the competition level that's been played. I think Clemson's and the big thing to me is I think Clemson's secondary is ripe to be exploited, particularly the guys like Muse or Mullen. I just don't have a lot of faith in the athleticism they have in the back end. And again, the safety position is a real concern to me when because Alabama's going to spread them out in a way Notre Dame didn't. Notre Dame had a lot of success against Clemson by spreading them out, moving the ball between the 20s. And the moment they hit about the 40-yard line of Clemson, when the field started getting compressed, where they couldn't get the safeties back, they couldn't really exploit the athleticism because they didn't have the wide receiver talent, and they shut down. Alabama's way more capable of doing that than Notre Dame. And I also think the Notre Dame game is just kind of weird because Notre Dame hadn't really struggled in that way all year, but they had struggled a lot. Notre Dame got held to 2.1 yards per carry against Pitt, 3.9 yards per carry in the last game against USC, won that game by 7 points, 3 yards per carry against Northwestern, had to pull it out late. It wasn't shocking to see Notre Dame get stalled. No matter what the ranking was or anything else, that wasn't out of line. What was a little more out of line was that Clemson was more successful against Notre Dame than they had been in other games. Again, there's an inconsistency issue. So you've got to go one or two ways in this, and then I'll let it bounce back to you. You either have to buy into the narrative that Clemson is peaking, that the Notre Dame game was a sign that Clemson's peaking. Because, again, when they faced units of this caliber, Notre Dame's caliber, if they faced a run defense that was a top 25 defense, they did not run the ball at any point this year. When they faced a top 25 offense, they got torched. So either Notre Dame was them peaking and doing better, or a change, or something like that, or you've got to buy in the other scenario, which is Notre Dame was more of an aberration, and that Notre Dame really wasn't as good as their metrics. I'm hedging towards the latter. The problem is it makes this score really hard to predict because it's one way or the other. Either Notre Dame was an aberration or Clemson got better. And however you want to go with that is whether you're going to pick, in my opinion, is whether you're going to pick Clemson to win in a close-ish game or whether you think Alabama's going to win by a significant margin.
And this is something that's kind of unique, I think, to our channel in that we love Clemson fans, and they've been great on this channel. Some of them do bring their flamethrower in the comments, but if we wanted to just grow the channel and grab a bunch of subscribers, we'd make everybody happy and say it's going to be the close game, and that's what's going to happen. And I know that people think that we're wearing a Homer SEC fan hat right here. We're not. We've picked SEC teams to lose. We picked Florida to lose, got killed for it. Obviously, we were wrong. It's not that. It's just I would rather be honest to what I think I see in the numbers and the data. And if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, and I'll own it when I'm wrong. We're not doing this to just come in here and pick a nice score and make everybody happy. And it's no shade to Clemson. We've said all year they're the second best team in the country, and I still think that. I think Alabama, there's a couple of things that went a certain way in how they played that game against Oklahoma that kept that from being a 70-30 type game. So I don't think that, I'm not saying that Clemson is worse than Oklahoma or any of that. Let's flip this around for the last question to you. True or false? If Clemson wins this game, it'll be because Christian Miller's injury is huge and or they were able to just score a lot of points and win a shootout? Or do you think if Clemson wins this game, it's a 17-21 type of game?
I just don't see Clemson being able to hold Alabama to 20 points. No one's done it all year. Mississippi State wasn't able to do it. In Mississippi State, Clemson fans can laugh at that all they want. Mississippi State's pass defense was a lot better than Clemson's this year.
Mississippi State's defense is better than Alabama's.
Yeah, it is. It's the best defense in college football this season. They've got 2 first-round draft picks. I know Clemson has an awesome defensive line. Not disputing that. Mississippi State has between 2 and 3 first-rounders on their defensive line that are all pass rushers. You've got Green and Sweat on the outside, and Jeffrey Simmons is as good as a Christian Wilkins or Dexter Lawrence in the middle. And quite frankly, I know Clemson fans may not love to hear it, but the Mississippi State guys are just as good, if not better, at rushing the passer. The big difference is Mississippi State's secondary is very, very good as well. They held Alabama to 24, and that was an injured Tagovailoa in a game where Alabama knew they didn't have to score because Mississippi State was not going to. I don't think you can hold Alabama to 20. Clemson has to score points in this game. There's 2 routes, in my view, for Clemson to get to that point. The first route is that Clemson can run the ball successfully. Now, as I pointed out before, when Clemson has faced top-level run defenses, they have not run the ball well this year. The exception was really, again, Notre Dame was kind of the exception in the second half where they ran the ball well. They did not run the ball well in the first half at all. It took them basically breaking the game open to do so. And I think to a large extent it was because Notre Dame was having to protect their corners with their safeties. And so if you're able to do that, and the reason they would be able to do that is, you pointed out Christian Miller. I think the issue with Christian Miller in the run game is depth. Anthony Jennings for Alabama is the better run stopper, which, I'm drawing partly off the Clemson game last year, right, where Jennings gave Clemson so many fits. Miller was an issue against Oklahoma when he went out pretty badly because they needed the speed to stay with Kyler Murray, who was the fastest player in the field. That 55-yard in the air touchdown pass that Kyler Murray throws, he has to sidestep Anthony Jennings in the pocket on that play when he releases the ball downfield. And if you have a faster linebacker on the field on that play and you get a hand on Murray, that doesn't happen. I don't think that problem is such a big deal against Clemson. Like you said, Lawrence is not a statue, but he ain't Kyler Murray. Kyler Murray can play a different position in the NFL. He's one of those guys that could play corner. He's probably more athletic, honestly, than a Denard Robinson. He's a freak. So I think the bigger issue for Alabama has actually been the injury to Buggs, who didn't play against Auburn, barely played against Georgia, and was not very effective in that game and wasn't terribly effective against, and came out of the game against Oklahoma. Lacking him in the run game was killer because they don't have depth. I think the issue with Miller is that when Jennings comes out, they're going to have to put somebody on that's a lot smaller. The Mosley guy and the Anoma guy you're pointing out are not nearly as big, and they're not as physical as Miller. So that's all kind of the problem for them. So that's one issue. The other issue, again, we talked about this ad infinitum. It's whether Alabama's corners can give up deep shots. Because if they have to move the ball in a typical pro-style attack on just running normal little out routes and that kind of thing, I just don't see it happening. I don't think they're good enough to do that against what's a very good defense. Good enough to stay at the level that Alabama will be at and score 30 plus with that kind of an offense.
All right, y'all. That's it for Alabama Clemson. I hope we did a good job of hiding the Z a little bit this time. Shout out to Clemson superfan on Twitter, Amanda Paget. I hope I'm pronouncing the last name right. She seems to be like literally the nicest person on Twitter. I think she listens to basically every college football podcast in the world and does actually listen to ours and lets us know when she disagrees with us and does it with a smile. So I appreciate that. Y'all, thanks so much for riding with us this year. We're going to do a lot of all-season content. I promised it last year. It didn't really materialize, but we've got some momentum now, and the live show stuff's been a lot of fun. So maybe we can turn this around and get a live show going to react from what we see in the Clemson-Alabama game, and y'all can get on us if we are wrong and Clemson pulls it out. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.